And all right, I think we are streaming. It's crazy doing this every time because it's always different, and we're using new software tonight. All right, we are live on YouTube, I believe, and I think both Sam, who is here handling the tech here, and Gail out on the Olympic Peninsula is looking at the chat, and I think between them they're going to be looking at the YouTube window, and it's kind of all confusing because there's so many different things going on for me. But I'm going to pretend that I'm calm and relaxed. And Sam, can we get a sweep of the room, but slower than last time? Because last time it went like this, whoosh, and you couldn't see that there was really anyone here. Next time we could probably take that right off the mount to do that. All right, you guys are all on camera now. All right. Woo! It's like having a flashback to something. Okay. Welcome all to Astrology Night here at SoulFood Coffeehouse in scenic downtown Redmond, Washington, the bicycle capital of the world. Why is that? I don't know. Yeah, anyhow. We have, I think, an interesting agenda tonight, partly because we have interesting circumstances going on out there in the real world, and they are pretty crazy. Just a little bit of quick, what's the word called? Help me. Housekeeping. God, I used to have a brain. It's interesting. A little bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to talk for about an hour about some of the big things that are going on. I have a few things in specific that I really want to cover. As I've been saying for the last few months, we've shifted gears here a bit because I used to kind of repeat at Astrology Night exactly what I do on my monthly forecast, because there didn't used to be a monthly forecast done separate from what we did here until COVID. And then that developed its own style and whatever. So rather than repeating the day by day by day, you can get that on my YouTube channel on the May forecast. And that does cover pretty much day by day. And also, we now have little chapter timestamps, so if you want to just go to May 22nd, you can just click at the very, very bottom of the description and go right to any one of the pages, which makes it easier to navigate through that. So I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to break for about 15 minutes or so. And then if you've never had your chart done here and you want to, there'll be these things on this table to fill out with your name, and you can put your whole name, please, but I will not use your last name online. And put your name and your birth date, place, and time of day, AM or PM, and also your email address. And I'll draw 3 names out of the hat after the break. So that's what's going on here, and there will be timestamps on this for people watching it, so that if you just want to go to the charts, you can just jump right there, and so it makes it easier to navigate. So, and I see that there are people online. I got like one eye on that and one eye on what's going on here. It's all very strange. Technology is strange. Which is the first thing I want to talk about. So, astrology to me is really based upon one concept, and that's the concept of making connections between things. What's here, what's there. And often the connections that we're making in astrology are connections between what's here, I mean here on Earth in the mesocosm, in the middle cosm, the microcosm being the subatomic realms and the inner psychic realms, and the macrocosm being the planetary and cosmological realms. And so often what astrology is making connections typically between what's happening here in the mesocosm, in our circumstances of our individual lives and our collective lives when we look at what's going on the globe. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because that's one of the things that I want to talk about at the beginning, and that is the role of technology and why it's changing astrology. Astrology is no longer what it used to was. I know. But we'll get there in just a moment. So astrology is about making connections, but the things that we're making connections between are the things typically that are in our individual personal lives. That's individual personal astrology, and or what's going on in the news, what's going on in the culture. Two, events that are to non-astrologers visible. They're out of the range of perceptions. You know, anyone who has studied astrology a bit knows that around age 28, 29, 30, when we go through our first Saturn birthday, what we astrologers call our Saturn return, we know that things happen in our lives. We grow up, we buy homes, sell homes, change jobs, change careers, go back to school, you know, move away from home, move to a new house, buy a home, sell a home, kill our parents, kill our kids. You know, we don't do any of those things. But there are big things that we do that set in motion the rest of our adult life. And then at around age 57, 58, when we have our second Saturn birthday, again, we look back and say, well, where have I been? What's worked? What hasn't worked? Where am I at now? And what do I need to do to make the next third of my life, roughly the third, 0 to 30, think of, and 30 to 60, and 60 to 90, sounds like a car. You know, is how fast can you get from 30 to 60? 30 years. Doesn't matter how fast you're driving. Okay, so what's different about astrology these days than ever before is something that's very profound and most people never think about. Most astrologers never think about. This is something I've talked about at astrology conferences a few times. It's one of my little pet things that I think is important, but most astrologers don't understand or have never really thought about why astrology is different today than it was 150 years ago. And it has to do with what I call cosmic feedback loops. You're not going to read it in a book, and you're not going to find it on Google unless it has my name attached to some presentation I've done. Until we hit the mid-60s, and a group, actually the sound technician for the Grateful Dead, Owsley, who was incidentally also the major producer of LSD during that period of time. But he developed a technique of stacking amplifiers that until then no one had ever thought about, and that technique is what created the ability for rock and roll musicians to come out and play with 40 or 50 or 60 amplifiers stacked, making a wall of sound that could project loud enough so it could reach, several 100,000 people at Woodstock. When you put more power into a sound, what you get is something that a sound technician will call feedback. It's something that in electronics, engineers try to avoid. When you reach a point when the microphone, that's feedback. You don't like that. However, feedback can be used as a tool that changes the nature of the sound. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, if you imagine yourself living, let's say in the early 1800s, and let's just pick two characters that I happen to know a little bit about their individual stories, who were contemporaries. And both of them revolutionized the world that they live in. One of them died relatively unknown. The other one was relatively famous, but not nearly as famous as that person is today. And the two people I'm talking about are the British mystic poet engraver William Blake, who was born in the mid-1700s and produced his work through the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. The contemporary of his I'm talking about is Ludwig van Beethoven, who only lived a few hundred miles away in Germany, but the two of them lived and died and never heard of each other. And they were both great at what they did. And why this is so important is that when there are major slow-moving planetary transits, like the alignment of Uranus and Pluto that happens every century or so, which is what created astrologically the 60s. Uranus on its 84-year cycle caught up to Pluto on its 248-year cycle in Virgo, and that Uranus-Pluto conjunction, it was the backbone of what we call the 60s. There were other astrological things that fed into it. Or, for example, the alignment of Neptune taking 165 years to go around once, and Pluto, the 248 years, but they only align from Earth's point of view about once every pretty close to every 400 years. And they did that in the 1890s. And the changes that we went through in the 1890s were the rise of mysticism in England and Sigmund Freud publishing the interpretation of dreams and the origins of what became quantum physics. And these things changed the nature of how we look at the outer and inner worlds. But these slow-moving events back then, if you were living through one of those events back in the 1890s, let's say, or in the 1810 to 1815 period of time, you wouldn't know that the revolution that was happening on the streets in London was also happening on the streets in Warsaw and in Rome, and in Paris, because there was not that instantaneous communication that we have now. Do you understand what I'm saying? That Beethoven and Blake didn't know about each other because they weren't on email. Today, because we have this instantaneous digital communication, before the telegraph was invented in the 1860s, there was no instantaneous communication. In order to know when the harvest came in on the tea crop in China, the first boat that could make it back to England was a significant event, because the person that knew whether the crop was big or not could invest money in it or not and gain wealth. You know, the saying of, there's something about the tea in China. What's the saying? What does this have to do with the price of tea in China, huh?
Yeah, not for all the tea in China.
Yeah, and the reason is because knowing the price of tea in China was a big deal, because it took 3 months or 4 months to get to England so someone could invest. Now, when it rains in northern China more than normal, we know about it as it's raining, and we can see pictures of it. What this has to do with astrology is this. When there are major astrological happenings, and you know something's going on, and you go down to the bar or the tavern, and you talk to your buddies, and you go, oh my God, things are really crazy. And they go, yeah, things are crazy for me too. And what's going on? Well, I don't know, everything's different, ever since they invented the steam engine, and now, blah. I mean, there's things, but you don't know that people are having that exact same conversation everywhere. And what's significant about that is that these events happen very slowly, and they hold the position for weeks, for months, and they resonate even for years. In fact, when an event happens astrologically on these slow-moving planets, that the points where those events occur, like Saturn conjuncting Pluto, in January of 2020 at, 21 degrees, I think it was, of Capricorn, that point was an important point. And when faster moving planets caught up with that point, it re-resonates it. It re-stimulates it. But 100 years ago, no one would have noticed, or they would have noticed and said, gee, I wonder if this is as crazy as it was back when, blah, 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 blah. But now what happens, and this is the cosmic feedback loops, is every time a planet re-stimulates one of these slow-moving events, we see 2 days of videos from everyone who recorded shit when it was going on at that moment. And so it's like we're in this super hyper self-feedback mode where we're overstimulating the transits without even knowing it. Do you understand what I'm saying? And this changes the game completely, because events that used to just come and go and take months or years or a generation to come to fruition and manifest as anything now are happening instantaneously, and we can't let go of it. Every time when you look at certain events, things that have to do with police brutality is just a good example. It's a horrible example, but when something happens, that 2 months later, when something happens similarly, all of a sudden, all over the news, all over the internet, all over the Instagram, there are the resonances of this exact same energy that come back again and again and again and again. And this changes everything. And without delving too far into this, do people know who Marshall McLuhan was? Handful. So I think that Marshall McLuhan may be one of the most, may have brought to our understanding one of the most important concepts that any human has ever brought to our understanding of how we live in a culture. And I would put it up there as high as astrology itself. It has nothing to do with astrology on the surface. And you've heard of Marshall McLuhan's sayings. Have you ever heard of the medium is the message? Yeah. Okay. Well, that is an incorrect attribution to one of Marshall McLuhan's books, which was a pun on the medium is the message. And the name of the book was The Medium is the Massage. And the claim of McLuhan was that it matters less what we're listening to on a radio back in the 1920s and 30s than we're listening to a radio. It matters less what we're watching on television than we're watching television. It matters less what we're seeing on the internet compared to the fact that we're looking at the internet. In other words, the medium itself is the message because it massages the ratio of our sense organs. And again, I mean, I could talk about this for 3 hours and still barely touch the surface, but it's such an important concept because it has to do with the non-astrological background of why the astrology of these times is so significant. McLuhan said that before there was print technology, before there was writing, that we lived in tribal societies, that our sense organs were balanced so that the tribal drums and the smells at night and the sounds we heard were just as important as what we saw. But as printed, as the alphabet took over, this basically changed the orientation and the predominance of our sense organs, and it turned us through the advent of the invention of the printing press, which actually occurred the year that Uranus aligned with Pluto in 1455, just like the first IBM mass-produced computer in 1965 was when Uranus aligned with Pluto. These are Uranus technological, Pluto total transformational breakthroughs. And, but it was the printing press that became the subject of McLuhan's first major book called The Gutenberg Galaxy, and about how literate human beings were different creatures because all of a sudden into Western culture came perspective, national ideologies. Why? Because they have points of view that when you read a book, you're separate. It detaches us from nature, and rather than being an integral part of nature, now seeing is believing. Get it? And again, I'm just scratching the surface here, but I'm trying to paint the picture that we don't appreciate what the invention of the telegraph was, that basically took this entire planet, where it would take months or even years to get information from one side of the planet to the other, to almost overnight, but it took about a decade for enough cables to be laid so that you could get signals instantaneously from one side of the planet to the other. And of course, the signals at that time were simply dots and dashes, but they were basically still information, the Morse code. No one could have imagined in the mid-19th century, when Maxwell, coming up with all these equations of how this new mysterious electromagnetic energy radiated, no one could have imagined that we could somehow package it, accelerate it, package it meaning reality, and accelerate it to the speed of light, and then decode it on the other end so that we can have 513 people watching this live right now all over the world. I mean, we take it for granted, and yet even though we can stop and be amazed at it, we don't grasp the importance of this to astrology, because we can talk about events and we can see the ramifications all over the planet instantaneously. Are you with me? Do you get what I'm saying? So now let's kind of bring this back. And by the way, I'll put a link to a talk that I did. It was a keynote talk for the Canadian Astrology Conference last fall, on the, I'm trying to put it into one sentence. It's a talk that's similar but less evolved than the one that I'll be giving at NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference here in Seattle on Memorial Day weekend. Anyone going to NORWAC, the local conference? Go, good. And for those of you who are not, and those online who are not, it will be online virtual, as a virtual conference also, and so you can attend. I'm one of, like, I don't know, 20 or so amazing speakers. It's a group that I'm proud to be a part of, because there's just a lot of really, really smart and good people, good astrologers talking. But the topic, and like I said, I'll put a link to this talk that I did. It was about the rebalancing of the whole thing. It's hard to say in a sentence, of gender fluidity balancing, equilibrialization. Did I make that word up? I don't know. But the problem is that astrology was written by guys for guys. It's a patriarchally oriented study, because it came from a time when women weren't allowed to read or write, and were simply property of men, at least in Greece and ancient Greece and in Rome, and really up until, in some places, last week. Actually, in some places, still till today. I don't want to go there. I mean, I do go there, but not for tonight. However, astrology is experiencing the same breakdown or the recreation of a lot of its concepts and imagery, having to deal with this right brain, left brain balancing, because when we read a book and when we read print, the brain has to process logical and sequentially, and that happens in the left brain, which is connected to the right hand, which in Latin is dexter, You know, and if you have two right hands, you don't have two right, I'm sorry, if you have two hands that you can use, they're not two hands, they're two right hands because it's ambidextrous, it's two right hands. Meanwhile, the right brain, which processes the instantaneousness of things emotionally and artistically but not logically, that happens in the right hand, left brain. But in the left brain, that stuff is more the yin, the feminine energy, and the left in Latin is sinister. I mean, it's so entrained into our language that, you know, that sinister means left, and dexter is dexterous, means right. So what we're seeing is this breakdown between the two brains, the right brain and the left brain, where since the technology of language has become so important, it's created, in effect, what we call the patriarchy because of that dominance of the right hand, left brain, which has brought us to this place where we live in a world where we are at a breaking point that is as large as any of the major cultural breakthroughs that we've seen in the past, that in some ways has to do with the breakdown of, I'm going to say, left brainness, which has to do with dominance, which has to do with colonialism, which has to do with capitalism out of the fear of not having enough. It has to do with so many of the difficulties that we're experiencing on the planet right now. And that doesn't mean that we're going to see a rise of the matriarchy, because that's not going to be as functional as, that's not going to be functional either. What we're going to see is either an equalization of these energies, and this is what we're experiencing all around. Now, bringing this to this month, this year. I know I've spoken about this a little bit before, but in April and in May, this stuff comes to a major head. And it really is going to take the rest of the year, and in fact, much of this decade to play through. We're at the front end of a shift that we can't imagine how large it is, because we've never been here before. We can, however, go back to the last time that Pluto moved from Capricorn, the sign of structure, of status quo, of stability, where it was in the mid-1700s. And then it moved into Aquarius in the mid-late 1700s, so that the United States was actually founded July 4th, 1776, with Pluto at the very end of Capricorn. But by the time the Constitution was ratified, by the time the government was created, by the time the Revolutionary War was won, Pluto had moved into Aquarius. And on top of that, there was something else that happened at that point in time, which has not happened again since April last month. And that's this. Every 14 years, let me back up. Okay, oh, that's a different perspective. Every 12 years, Jupiter returns to where it was 12 years ago. In other words, from Earth's point of view, Jupiter is a 12-year cycle. It takes Jupiter 12 years to go through the zodiac or go around the sun once, okay? Jupiter is the magnifying lens of astrology. It's the planet of bigger, better, more, whoops, too much, crap, way too much. I mean, anyone who thinks that too much is good, or growth, which is what Pluto is about, is good, just think about a malignant tumor. It's Jupiter without any restraint. Too much of a good thing, contrary to what Mae West used to say, is not a good thing. She used to say, I've had less and I've had more is better. That's true to a point. But Jupiter is about expansion. It's a magnifier. It makes things seem bigger. And when something seems bigger and it looks good, we often go in that direction, which is why Jupiter in a chart is often related to good luck. It's often related to travel, to making big ideas. I mean, that's what Jupiter's meaning is. It's a magnifying lens. So Jupiter takes 12 years to go around once. Uranus takes 84 years to go around once. Now, Uranus is the planet that it was the first planet outside of Saturn. You know, if you had lived 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, matter of fact, if you'd lived 300 years ago, Saturn was the outward limit. There was nothing beyond Saturn that moved. Out past Saturn, there was just the fixed stars. Saturn was the boundary. Saturn was Satan, that the angels had to fall through the gates of Saturn to become three-dimensional. It was the difference between the divine proportion and the human proportion. Saturn was the limit. Saturn was the gatekeeper. Saturn was the grim reaper. Saturn was Father Time. Saturn is just Latin for chronos, which is Greek for the time that is measured. It's the time of a timeline. When Uranus was discovered, around the time that Pluto went into Aquarius in the 1700s, overnight, people's minds were blown because the local real estate of what we thought was the world, was the universe, was the planets, was tripled. Instead of having a 29.5-year Saturn cycle being the slowest known rhythm, and beyond that there was nothing, all of a sudden there was an 84-year rhythm. That was Uranus. Uranus is the planet of shock, surprise, awe. It's the planet of revolution. It's the planet of breakthrough. Uranus, because of those things, is associated with the future, with technology. Are you with me? So we have Jupiter, the magnifying lens, taking 12 years to go around once. Meanwhile, Uranus, which takes 84 years to go around once, has moved a little bit further along. So it takes Jupiter 12 years to go around once and then another couple of years to catch up to Uranus. Jupiter catches up to Uranus every 14 years, kind of like the moon catches up to the sun once a month. Every new moon is simply the moon going around once and then going a little bit further to catch up with the sun in the next sign. So we have a new moon in Aries, and then 1 month later, the moon goes all the way around back to Aries, but it has to take another couple days for it to catch up to the sun, which has now moved into the next sign, Taurus. So astrologers use the alignment of any two planets to kind of set the metronome. That's the timekeeper. And you can do that with any pair of planets. And in fact, if in your birth chart you have a conjunction in your chart, you're just saying that you were born at the start of one of those cycles. If you have an opposition in your chart, you're born halfway through. Because when we look at aspects in a birth chart, we're just looking at the relationship between the faster moving planet to the slower moving planet if it makes a particular angle. You with me? All right, so what the hell does this have to do with April and May? And for that matter, 2024, 25, 26, 27, and 28. And 2020. And the 1960s. And the 1850s. Okay. The problem with cycles is they don't have a beginning or an ending. They have apparent endings. You know, our apparent beginning is our birth and our apparent ending is our death. But anyone who's done spiritual or metaphysical work knows that the birth and death are just points on a trajectory that we don't get to experience while we're here. You know, that there's very little question from anyone who's really done any serious digging into this that consciousness does not need a body to be conscious. We're not having that discussion tonight. But it's one that I would love to have. It's one that I have often, actually, but not here. All right, so in April, in fact, on April 20th, Jupiter caught up with Uranus, as it does once every 14 years. no big deal. Well, it actually is kind of a big deal, because when you look at the clockwork of Jupiter's conjunctions with Uranus, I just took a couple of notes so I would remember, because I know a lot of these things off the top of my head, but I forget to mention them. I think the best example in modern times of Jupiter catching up with Uranus is that not only did Jupiter line up with Uranus on July 20th, 1969, but on July 20th, 1969, within a few hours of the exact alignment of Jupiter with Uranus, because the alignment lasts for days, weeks before, and days, weeks, months after, because they're very slow-moving planets. But within a couple of hours of the exact moment of Jupiter aligning with Uranus on the evening of July 20th, 1969, the moon swept right in the middle of that and was right there. And that was the evening that Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. So, and if you think about it, Jupiter is a magnifying lens that expands our understanding, its growth, it makes things bigger, and Uranus is the planet of breakthrough, sudden shock, awe, surprise, amazing technology. Now that conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus happened to occur in the sign of Aquarius, which is the sign of the future and the sign of breakthrough anyhow. But there are other examples. I mean, going back to 1899, there was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and that was actually the publishing of Freud's interpretation of dreams on the tail end of that Neptune-Pluto conjunction that happens only once every 400 years. That was in the earlier 1890s. But like and it was also when Max Planck came up with the idea of the quanta. The quantum, a basic unit of measurement of something that happens, that's happening so we can measure it, but there are other things going on. And then it was 2 Jupiter-Uranus cycles later, 14 and 1428. In 1928, in the 2728, at the next Jupiter, one skipped and then the following, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, that was the first meeting in Copenhagen of what we call the Copenhagen Group, which was Niels Bohr, kind of father of quantum physics, so to speak, and Albert Einstein and Max Born and Heisenberg and all of those subatomic explorers, Wolfgang Pauli and Dirac, and these incredible minds that were stunned because they discovered a whole new world that didn't seem to follow the laws of physics. But other Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions within the year gave us things like the telegraph, which I talked about before, 1844. 1879, the light bulb was invented by Edison, the year of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. In 1920, the first commercial radio broadcast, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. In fact, even in 1969, while the lunar landing was occurred, within a couple of months of that was the first internet transmission. It was still part of the military, but that was the first internet transmission in 1969. And at the following Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in 1976, that was when the 2 Steves made their first personal computer, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Are they both Steves? Yeah. Okay. So that happened last month. But here's the thing, it happens every 14 years. But in astrology, planets they resonate to a sign. Every planet has a home sign that it somehow buzzes the energy in that sign. For example, Mercury buzzes the energy of Gemini and Virgo. It's at home in both those signs. The moon hums or buzzes the energy of Cancer. The sun, Leo. Mars, Aries. And in traditional astrology, before the outer planets were discovered, it was also associated with Scorpio, and so on. Uranus is the planet that hums or buzzes in modern astrology the energy of Aquarius. Now here's the kicker. So we had Jupiter last month lining up with Uranus, and Uranus, we know, hums the energy of Aquarius, and Pluto has moved into Aquarius for the first time in 240 some odd years. And we look back and we say, if Jupiter and Uranus just align, Jupiter magnifies that Uranian energy. What's going on in Aquarius? Well, Pluto's in Aquarius. Pluto is about the breakdown and deconstruction, reconstruction, the death and rebirth of anything, not necessarily physical person, but it's just that process that Nietzsche called nihilism. It's that which is most important, disintegrates, goes to the bottom, gets rebuilt again. I mean, it's a process of evolution. The last time that Pluto entered Aquarius, as we talked about earlier, was in the late 1700s. Just a year after Pluto moved into Aquarius, Jupiter aligned with Uranus, and Uranus had just been discovered at that time. And within 2 weeks of that exact alignment, the Bastille was stormed, and this is considered to be the turning point in the French Revolution. Now, we moderners learn about, the American Revolution and the founding of the country, and we learn about the French Revolution, but we don't have a fucking clue as to what it was like, because until those two events that happened, every nation was owned by someone who had divinely inherited through their bloodline the right to own a country. We call that a monarchy or royalty. And the idea of people getting together and saying, we're not going to be responsible to King George of England, we're kicking off the monarchy, and in fact, we're not only doing that, we're going to set up a government that doesn't have a king. It's going to be ruled by people. We don't understand how impossible it was at that time to even think those thoughts. And by the same token, to be in France and to think that you were going to in some way take down the government run by one person who was in effect the monarch, whether it was King Louis XIV or whether it was Napoleon. It was still a one person running the show. And yet at the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, the first Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that occurred when Pluto moved into Aquarius, the sign of the collective, the sign of the modern, of the new, of the future, that was in 1789. July 6th, 7th? When was the storming of the Bastille? July 6th, I think? 1789. That was basically the individuals of France taking over the monarchy, basically taking over. But something else happened in 1789. Now, again, the United States of America, we say, was born on July 4th, 1776. Most astrologers know that chart. We understand it. We work with it. It seems to be valid. That was the Declaration of Independence, incidentally written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, who was an Aries. You can't make this shit up like that. Aries is about independence. It's about freedom. This guy says, we're independent. We're declaring ourselves free. It wasn't until 1787, though, that there was the first Constitutional Congress that created the Constitution in New York, and it was ratified at the first congressional session at the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in 1789. The first Jupiter-Uranus conjunction when the people, in effect, were taking over. And not only was that the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, but it was also the first session of Congress. And in that first session of Congress, Congress created what we call the American judicial system. The American judicial system was created at the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, the first Jupiter-Uranus conjunction after Pluto moved into Aquarius in the 1770s and into the 1780s. We are now at a point at this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction when Pluto, for the first time since then, is back in Aquarius. Do you see where I'm going with this? All right, so Jupiter is the planet of big ideas. It's the planet that in astrology rules higher education. It rules the philosophy and the ideas that one learns when one is at a university. And Uranus is about radical breakthrough. It's about the rebellion. It's about the sudden shift. It's about the lightning striking. In fact, astrologers often refer to Uranus as Uranus the Awakener, because this light bulb goes on. Ah, I got it. I see it. Now, once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is what's going on the college campuses right now. This is not just a little flash in the pan, and I don't care. Well, I don't mind. I care. But I don't mind what your individual politics may be. This isn't the place to have those discussions, and I certainly have my opinions, and they probably leak out, but I'm not here to promote my perspectives on this. What I am here to do is to point out that something is happening on the awareness of the public, not just at UCLA, not just at Columbia, not just at college campuses all around the country. It's in the thousands now already of students that have been arrested. It's not just that. It's about public demonstrations all over the planet. It's about governments reacting in ways that are making statements. And again, this is not about this event. It's about what this event means for the larger transition that we're moving through. And I would just be very clear that just because I can talk about these events doesn't mean I know what the hell's going to happen. That's going to take time. I mean, I think that the wheels are still in spin. But the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of April 20th was not a moment in time. Well, it was a moment in time, but as I've said again and again from different points of view, that astrology, when we look at planets, we see events. We see someone's birth. We look at a birth chart. We see a transit. We see a revolution, a plane crash, and we look at those events. We see events almost as if they were a moment. However, when we look at light through our technological finesse, we see light as a particle, as a moment. We see it as a photon. However, light travels like a wave, no question about it. This is the quantum dilemma called the particle-wave duality. Light travels like a wave, but when we measure it, somehow it pops into a particle. Well, the planets are the same way. We see the particles, we see the event, we see the natal chart, we see the disruption here or there, or we see a military action on October 6th or 7th, whenever that was, sorry, I don't, 7th. We see a moment when there was a military action, and we note, oh my God, Mars, the planet of war, on that day was squaring Pluto, the planet of dominance and power and transformation that has to do with the force of two immovable forces meeting. That was on that day. And in fact, since then, every interaction between a planet and Pluto has re-stimulated something, not that it's ever gone away, and in fact, not that it was created in October of 2023, because it's obvious that that's a particle, that's a moment, that's an astrological event, but we can see that tied back to the past. And that's where we're going next, because this is what we need to understand May of this year. When we look at a different pair of planets, one of the most interesting pairs to look at from a standpoint of cultural change, of civilization development, is the relationship or the pairing of Saturn, which again was it wasn't the king of Olympus, but it was the finality, it was the rule, it was the law. Saturn was the absolute authority in the heavens. And when Saturn takes 30 years to go around once, 29 and a half years to go around once, Pluto, which moves very fast and very slow comparatively, I mean, it's very slow, but Pluto can whiz through a sign when it's close to Earth because it's such an elliptical orbit. It can whiz through a sign in 12, 13 years. And when it's far away, it can take 35 years or so to go through a one sign. So when Pluto is moving along and Saturn catches up to it, this is like a new moon. And that relationship is an incredibly important relationship because it happens about every 30, 35, 38 years. Again, it varies a bit. But it happens about 3 times a century. I call it waltz time for civilization because every 100 years, Saturn, Pluto go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And if you add in the opposition, which is the halfway point, well, then it sounds like a Strauss waltz. 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2. Okay. And remember, astrologers take any cycle like a new moon and they divide it in half. That's the full moon. They divide it in half again. That's a week. But in fact, you can continue dividing things in half and half and half, and that's the stress points on any cycle, are the divisions by half, 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 and half. So the last time that Saturn and Pluto aligned, like the new moon, from Earth's point of view, they joined up on January 12th, 2020. The time before that, when they were at full moon opposition, was in September of 2001. September 11th? Okay. Prior to that, the last time they were joined was in 1982, and the time before that when they were in opposition was 1965, and the time before that when they were joined was 1948, and in opposition 1931, and the time before that when they were joined was 1914. Now, these are just markers. 1914, within a week of their joining, was the assassination of Duke Ferdinand, started World War I. There was something else that happened in 1914, and that was Lawrence of Arabia went through the Mideast and got all the Arabs to fight on the side of the Allies and promised them freedom from the Turks if the Allies won the war. And it was after that war that we cut up the Mideast and created the countries that, that we now know as the Mideast. But going back to the previous opposition in 1898, at the previous Saturn-Pluto opposition, that was the founding of the World Zionist Organization. You can't make this stuff up this crazy. In fact, at the previous conjunction to that was a major meeting in Berlin of 14 European nations that carved up Africa. We're talking colonialism here, obviously. In 1931, at the opposition, that was the year that Japan invaded China, but it was also the year that Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler came to power. It was also the height of the Great Depression here in the United States. That was 1931. At the next conjunction in 1948, and all of these conjunctions, a slow enough cycle that we look at a year before, the year of, and a year after. That's the years of operation. And the year before the conjunction in 1947, I think I said 48, 1947, the United Nations was founded. And actually in that year, England basically presented to the Palestinians and the Jews, the Zionists in what's now Israel, this idea of creating 2 states. And both parties turned it down. That was 1946. United Nations founded, and in 1948, Palestine disappears, and we know what happened there. But the crazy thing is that as we go on to the next opposition in 65, I mean, the United States is at war in Vietnam, but this is also great Arab-Israeli, it's right around the 7-Day War. And there's a lot of energy going on there at that point in time. When we go to the next conjunction in 1982, and actually I took some notes on this because although I just didn't want to miss anything here, that in 1982, that was the Camp David Agreement was created, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. That was a big deal thing, but they followed it up with invading Lebanon, 1982, and put Beirut under siege. And it was also, incidentally, the only time in the 20th century when there was a colonial war in the Western Hemisphere. That was the Falkland Islands War, which wasn't a big deal to us, but it was to Argentina and England. I mean, people were killed and, bombs were dropped. It was a real war. It was also in Russia. It was the time of the, well, no, that was a little bit later. I was going to say Glasnost. That was we'll get to there in just a moment. Obviously, at the next opposition was within a few weeks of the bombing of the World Trade Tower. And then that was September of 2001. And then the next conjunction was in January of 2020, within one day, within about 12 hours of the announcement, the official announcement of the first, at that time called the coronavirus or the Wuhan virus. It was the announcement of the genome by the Wuhan lab, and that was like within the same day as the exact conjunction. And of course, that was a catalyst for what became that whole year, which was not just Saturn aligning with Pluto, but Jupiter also coming through that exact same point, aligning with Pluto and Saturn all at the same time, and other things. So we can see that this rhythm is an important rhythm. And again, we can divide a circle by half, that's the opposition, or by quarter, that's the square. But we can divide it even by half of that and get to what's called a half square or semi-square, something traditional astrology doesn't use, but we moderners do, because the ancients just thought everything was related to the zodiac, divide by 12, and it was the brilliant mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler who introduced to us the idea that there could be aspects that weren't based on 12. And in fact, when you divide a circle by 24, meaning by 12 and then half of that again, or by 4 and then by 8, that the division by 8 becomes instead of 0, 90, 180, 270, that's squares, you now get 0, 45, that's a half a square, 90, 135, 180, and so on. So what's happening in May that most astrologers are not seeing, because most astrologers are tied to the zodiac, and they don't see the importance of these, what I call these Kepler's aspects, and that is that on May 6th of this year, that's like 3 days away, we have an exact half square between Saturn and Pluto, and that's the first, what an astrologer would call stressful aspect between Saturn, the planet of boundaries, the planet of structure, the planet of the status quo, and Pluto, the planet of upheaval and transformation that has to do with gradual metamorphosis. If you think of TNT being detonated, that's Uranus. That's an explosion. It's instantaneous, an electrical shock, lightning, that's Uranus. But if you think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, that's Pluto, because it's an evolutionary metamorphosis that involves a complete total breakdown and reconstruction. So this is the first Saturn-Pluto stress test from what did or didn't happen back around 2020, which in fact can be traced back all the way to the crucifixion of Jesus, if you want to go back that far. I mean, the dates that fall into that and I will link, some of you may have already seen it, but I will put a link on the permanent, on this live stream on the YouTube, to a talk that I've done on the incredible history of the Saturn-Pluto cycle going back a couple thousand years. Not going to do that right now, obviously. But this stress test, you got to understand, as we were coming into 2020, the Israeli-Arab energy was incredibly stressed. But it wasn't the only colonial energy on the planet that was incredibly stressed. There was stress in Indonesia, stress in Taiwan, China, stress in Hong Kong with China also. I mean, there was stuff going on all around, and somehow it got sidetracked by what became the year that never ended, or March of 2020 that took a year and a half to kind of move through the quarantine. So this half square that's occurring now is really, really significant because, in a way, it's important to understand that these slower moving events a planet often will go through a point and then retrograde and then go direct again. And often on these slower moving transits, the actual angle is formed, and then planets go retrograde, it's formed again, and then again. So it occurs over a period of a year or two or three, where, for example, the Uranus-Pluto square that defined the 20-teens was exact 7 times between 2012 and 2015. And those were the rock and roll years where everything from the 60s was all of a sudden back in our face from the conjunction of the Uranus-Pluto, including civil rights, gender equality or lack of it, environment, power politics, money. I know I'm missing important things. Huh? Psychedelics and internal ecology, the legalization, first medically and then recreationally for a lot of substances. All these things during that Uranus-Pluto square defined the 2020s, but focused on the 2012 to 2015 period. So what we're seeing now is, with this half square, the distractions that we've had to deal with during the 2020, 21, 22 period are now back in our face. And because of technology, because of the fact that everyone has a video camera. I mean, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, there was no such thing as a video camera. You had a Super 8, film project or film, camera, expensive and cumbersome. And now pretty much everyone has a video camera in their pocket, better than the old Super 8s were back in the 50s and 60s. So what we're getting is this global feedback loop, that we can't get away from these events, and we're seeing them in new waves because we're seeing the events again and again and again and again, and every time something comes through that spot, up comes all the playing of the things that happened last week, last month, last year, last decade that resonate to this, and it's changing the game. Now, the first of three Saturn-Pluto half squares or semisquares occurs exactly on May 6th. But we're already feeling it, we're seeing it, and we're seeing it on the tail end of the Jupiter-Uranus opening for the first time in 250 years, since 1789 actually, since Pluto is in Aquarius, and Jupiter and Uranus is a portal opener. Because Jupiter expands, it's like we get a glimpse of the future, and our minds are open, and right behind that there's this boundary issue that comes in our faces, and this is the first of 3 semisquares, the first one exact on May 6th. That doesn't mean that'll be the height of the energy, because these slow-moving events are like chronic illnesses that get triggered by acute symptoms. That are the faster moving planets. But we're seeing this as a trigger going on right now. And then on the retrograde, we're going to see this Saturn semi-square Pluto for the second time on September 25th, give or take a couple of days, but it's exact on September 25th. And then direct on the third and final time on on January 26th, 2025, just shortly after what we can project, hopefully, to be a presidential inauguration. I say we can hope. Times are crazy right now. And I don't care how much astrology you know. In fact, one of the dangers of knowing a lot of astrology by a lot of astrologers is they use it as a system to project what they think they know is going to happen. And you have to be aware of that when you listen to most astrologers. And on a bad day, you can include me in that also, because it's just our natural tendency to think that we have a sense of where it's going and then look and go, oh, that's why. When the fact of the matter is, it's really difficult to know how this is going to play out. But I know the whens of what is going to be playing out. Are you with me here? And so we need to look at May as a bump, as a wave in what will be looked at historically as a significant tidal wave that washed through the 20-teens into and through the 2020s. That's what we're experiencing right now. And because of the Jupiter-Uranus opening, we're all ready to make some move. But some of us are eager to move into what we see as the future, and others are freaked the fuck out. And it makes sense, whether or not you agree with that position, for people to freeze, go into denial, and try to recover something from the past. You see what I'm saying? That what's playing out here is not surprising when you see what it is that's going on. Just like 250 years ago, there was people in the United States who said, it's crazy, why do you think we can go up against a monarchy, and what is this thing, freedom, who's going to tell us what to do? What we need is a good dictator. And there are people who believe that today. Okay. And they believe it for good reason, based upon their own fears of what they've grown up in, what they know, what they've learned, and what they see happening around them, and it scares the crap out of them. And even if you're eager for it, if it doesn't scare the crap out of you, you don't really see how big a shift it's going to be, because we think that we got this shift that's going on because Pluto's moved into Aquarius. Well, the age of Aquarius, which is like a 2,100-year transit, won't start for another 100 years. And so people who are saying, oh, this is the beginning of the age of Aquarius, there are people who said that in the 60s, when there were 7 planets in Aquarius in February of '62, and then you had hair and you had all this stuff that, you know, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, which was not written by astrologers, when the moon is in the 7th house, as it is once every day, and Jupiter aligns with Mars. Well, an alignment can be any aspect, so it happens several times a year. I mean, it was just, but consciousness gripped onto it and started talking about the age of Aquarius. But ages are 2,160 years long, and the best that we can figure, since we count the years from the beginning of the age of Pisces, Pisces being the fish being the symbol of Christianity, we even call it the age of Christianity, ACE, or, I think it's academically before the Common Era, or is that error? I'm not sure. But if we look at that as give or take a generation or two even from the birth of Jesus, we're still a century away from being in the age of Aquarius. And these shifts of ages are so huge and transformative that it takes that long for the shift to occur. And so when we talk about computers or AI or ET or whatever it is, we are like dipping our toe into a pond that we don't even know is an infinite ocean, and we will be in that ocean. That's how big this shift is. And so all I can say is, if you're not scared a little bit, you probably don't realize how big the shift is. Then again, once one understands the cosmology enough, you know, we're all part of this greater ocean, and we're just playing our little role, blipping into it and blipping out of it in these bodies. So let me just see what else I promised I would talk about. But I really, rather than talking about the day-to-day, I mean, the reason why May is so important is it's the first movement into this real rubbing up against. I mean, we've been rubbing up against it for a while, but when Saturn-Pluto reach these dynamic points, and there are astrologers that will tell you, oh, semisquares, they're not real because they're not astrology. Astrology is based upon a division of 12 because there are 12 signs in the zodiac. And I always ask my students, so how many signs, because some people say, oh no, there's 13 signs because blah, blah, blah. How many signs are there up there? The answer is none. They're all in here. We made this shit up. It's good shit. But the best way to look at a cycle, to figure out that cycle, is to divide it in half or in a third or in a quarter. And 12 is magnificent because, for those people who remember clocks with hands going around, you know, you can look at a cycle and you could see a quarter after or half past because 12 divides by 1, 2, 3, or 4 evenly. And so it makes a lot of sense that we use 12 for 12 hours in the day, 24 hours, which is just 12 times 2 hours, hours in, day and night together, 12 months in a year, even though there's really closer to 13 moon cycles. But we have a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar, because of the patriarchy. It's great to run an army, but it's difficult to track your menstrual cycle. I say yours because I don't track mine. But remember, over half the planet uses a lunar calendar. You know, the Arabs, the Hebrews, the Chinese, the Indians, the East Indians, they all use lunar calendars. But it's hard to mechanize to the outer world because that's what the sun does, the solar calendar. But 12 is great. 360 degrees in a circle. You know, you can divide that by 12 pretty evenly. Comes out to 30 degrees in a sign, so on. So many astrologers will say this Saturn-Pluto half square. I've seen so many YouTube videos, and I do watch other astrologers because I'm interested in what they have to say. But I've seen so many astrologers who go, April sucked, boy, May is amazing. It's just smooth sailing. May is integration. There's a lot of people out there saying that. And I'm saying, yeah, well, what about the Saturn-Pluto semisquare? There are other things, too, that make it, I think, a bit tricky. But anyone who dismisses this, all I can say is when we come back next month, and by the way, I put this online, but next month here for Astrology Night, we will not be meeting the first week of June because I'll be teaching in New York that weekend. We are meeting on May 31st on the last day of May, but it will be June's event. But when we come back at the end of May, we'll look back at May and see whether or not it was like just ice skating, downhill smoothly, or whether there maybe were some bumps in the road. So I didn't realize that this was showing up here this whole time. This is like, all right, all right, let me just see where we are. Okay, we just want to make sure that there were a few things that I said that I would touch base on, and I don't know if I can find them or not. But yeah, it was the Jupiter-Pluto, Pluto into Aquarius. We've talked about that. We'll be talking about that some more. This semi-square, which I think is so significant, and we've just really touched the tip of the top of that. The other thing that I want to talk about before we bail, we've just gone over a few minutes, but I'll cut this short pretty quickly, is the fact that when planets change signs, it's like a change of costume, a change of clothing, a change of how the energy expresses. And when the faster moving planets, and when we astrologers use the word planet, we of course include Pluto, we include the sun and the moon, because we're using the Greek concept of planet as anything that wanders. So I know better. But when the faster moving planets, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, change sign, I don't want to say it's not a big deal. If you're paying attention, you can feel it, you can see it. But it happens so regularly and so often, it's like, yeah, been here before, not a big deal. I know, I get it. When you get out past Mars to Jupiter, Jupiter spends an entire year in a sign. I believe this is the basis of Chinese astrology. Even though Chinese astrology is technically not based on the movement of the planets, China is a culture built upon social awareness, social contract. Confucianism is based upon the relationship of the individual to the greater. This is Jupiter's territory. And Jupiter spends 1 year in each sign. And Chinese astrology is what? Duh, it's a sign per year. It's Jupiterian. When Jupiter changes signs, we know it. However, sometimes when Jupiter changes signs, it's making another aspect and it becomes more important. And that's what's happening in May. Jupiter has been in the sign of Taurus, where it lined up with Uranus, which has been in Taurus for 6 years now, and Uranus will be moving out of Taurus into Gemini next year in 2025, which is part of what's going on here in April and May, but we don't know it. So here's the deal. Remember I said that Uranus is the planet that hums the energy of Aquarius, and Pluto is in Aquarius right now. So the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction back in April opened a portal into the future of what we see coming around the bend, even if we didn't realize that was what was going on. When Jupiter moves away from Uranus, and as it moves into through Taurus, and as it moves into Gemini on the 25th, I think, yeah, on May 25th, it'll spend about a year in Gemini. But here's the deal. Pluto, like all the real planets, has a retrograde phase. And technically, Pluto turned retrograde on May 2nd, yesterday, technically. The fact is that from a measurement standpoint, Pluto has been in the same place since since April 25th, and will be in the exact same place until about the 8th, 9th, 10th. It'll be at 2 degrees and whatever it is now, 2 degrees and 52 minutes. 1 degree and well, this is, yeah, 1 degree and 52 minutes. Pluto technically is retrograde, but for all practical purposes, it's not moving. And when a planet is when a planet moves slower, it builds more power. It's momentum. In other words, a fast-moving planet, the moon whizzes through a sign in a couple of days. It can trigger things, but it's not itself going to disrupt or create a major thing. It can trigger things that are already there. When a planet is slower, it has more power. That's why Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are more serious in their transits, in their impact as they move through the sky. So Pluto is the slowest moving of the traditional planets we use. And right now, Pluto is not stationary retrograde. It's stationary. Because even though from May 1st to June 1st, it actually backs up about almost 1/10 of a degree. It's basically not moving. And for that reason, Pluto is even stronger than it normally is. And remember, it's the aspects to Pluto that have triggered the important things, especially in relationship to what's been going on in the Mideast. The Mars aspects and the Venus, most recently, the Venus square to Pluto. And these, it's like clockwork. This is why the Mars half square to Pluto right now, I'm sorry, the Saturn half square to Pluto right now is so significant. But Pluto is holding power. When Jupiter, and it's at one, it's less than, it's moving backwards almost slowly, but it's at just about 1.5 to 2 degrees of Aquarius. When Jupiter, on May 25th, when Jupiter enters Gemini, it will be within a couple of degrees of making an exact trine to Pluto that will be exact the first week of June. Now, theoretically, we're not allowed to talk about that because we're here to talk about May. However, Jupiter is already got Pluto in its sights, and a trine is harmonious. It's flowing energy. But again, if you have a flowing energy between something that's too much and something that's about destruction and deconstruction at the ending of something so it can become a butterfly, too much may not necessarily be a wonderful experience, although in the long run it may be fantastic. You know, remember, a caterpillar is just a butterfly's way of getting to be another butterfly. So, we have, as Jupiter moves into Gemini, and when we're back here on May 31st, we'll talk a lot more about this because we'll just be a few days away from the exact Jupiter trine Uranus, Jupiter trine Pluto, and this will intensify the potential opportunity and growth from this whole process of what feels like the ending of what's going on. And remember, and here's the punchline to this whole piece, is that that too will just be part of a larger wave, because a year down the road, when Uranus, which spends 7 years in each sign, moves from Taurus into Gemini, it too will make a trine with Pluto, which will not have moved very far, will still be at the beginning of Aquarius, and that Uranus-Pluto trine will create a smoothness and a flow and an easy expression of energy between two badass planets. Pluto, the lord of the underworld, you know, Pluto, the planet of death, Pluto, the planet of regeneration, of evolutionary transformation, and Uranus, the planet of shock, surprise, and change, and sudden change, and rebellion, and opening. And remember, it was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction that created what we call the 60s. It was the Uranus-Pluto square that created the major part of the structural difficulties that we went through in the 20-teens, including the beginning of the breakdown of what some people say is the breakdown of our Constitution, our judicial system, and democracy. Oh, interesting. They were all formed at the last Jupiter-Uranus conjunction when Pluto was in Aquarius. Something's going on here. And so when we reach 2025, 6, 7, and 8, when Uranus in Gemini will be making a trine with Pluto in Aquarius, it'll be too late to make the changes that we now have on the table. So all of this is basically a rant to say that whatever your integrity reveals to you, whatever your spiritual practice, your intuition, your sense of what's going on, this is not a time to be quiet. It's not a time to just disrupt and get crazy. Why? Because Mars is in Aries, and Mars right now for the entire month in Aries is a bit hot under the collar. We can see some impulsive action happening that if we had just taken a few breaths, we might have been able to do something constructive rather than destructive. On the other hand, the opportunities that we have now as Saturn is making a half square to Pluto, and will again in September, prior to a presidential election here, by the time it makes that third and final half square next January, and we move closer to this period of Uranus trining Pluto, and I've used this image before, it's like taking brittle tin and mixing it with malleable copper and coming up with bronze that once it melts and then cures, that's the way it is. And we're going to get to that in 2 or 3 years, where it's not going to feel quite as disruptive and uncertain and complicated as it does now. However, if you look at all the important issues out there, take your 5 favorite, most crazy, impossible things that you feel strongly about. There'll probably be 2 or 3 of them that will solidify in a bowl that's exactly the shape that you like. And there's probably a couple that'll solidify in a way that you don't like. And that's just going to be the way it is. But the chance to make things happen is now. And so astrology is about connections. And we can look in the past and see these connections that have occurred based upon these similar rhythms. But it's not until we get to 20, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 2030 that we're going to be able to look back and see what the hell actually happened. But I'll tell you this, what happened when we're looking back at this from 2030, if we're not happy about it, we still deserve it, it's ours, it's our karma, because what's unfolding in this world is the sum total of all of us, and in some ways, what's happening is the storming of the Bastille. It can't happen, it's never happened before. There's never been a group movement, I'm speaking now as if we were in the 1770s, 80s, and early 1790s, there's never been a possibility of creating a successful rebellion against the monarchy, whatever monarchy there was, whatever national state there was. And by the same token, we can say in the United States, that's never happened before. But something is happening. And all I can think of is Bob Dylan's line from A Ballad of Thin Man. He wrote this to a guy who was writing a news story about him, and this guy was following him around. And the Ballad of Thin Man, the chorus is, but something's happening and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? That's where we're at. Huh?
I said Mrs. Jones knows, though.
Someone knows. Well, actually, I'm going to end with one of my, as people have studied with me through Patreon and whatever, have probably heard this story before. But there's a hymn of creation from the Vedas, which is the oral tradition of India, of the Hindu, the oral Hindu tradition. And one of the earliest Vedas is called the Rig Veda. And in the Rig Veda, there is a hymn of creation. And I can't and wouldn't do it from memory, even if I knew it, because it's almost as long as Longfellow's Hiawatha. But it starts off something like, in the beginning, there was neither light nor dark. In the beginning, there was neither good nor evil. There was neither up nor down, there was neither in nor out, and it goes on for pages. There was neither male nor female, there was neither beingness nor non-beingness, and blah, 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 blah. And then it ends with, but who knows for sure? Only he, and I like to say he, she, but that's my modernistic slant, gender neutral he, or unless we could say they. Only he knows for sure. Only he who sits on his throne in highest heaven, only he knows for sure. Or perhaps he does not. All right, we're taking a 10 or 15 minute break. If you want to get something from the coffee bar, do it now. Again, I always like to just remind us that we are here at the invitation of Soul Food, and if you haven't upped your $5, it would be really great if you could. It helps them defray some of the cost of staying open past their normal hours on Friday nights. And so that would be great. Also, I don't get anything out of this. I'm here because you are. But if you have anything to buy, some birthday gift, anniversary gift, something for yourself, there's a lot of cool stuff here. Buy something. The best way we can vote, or let me say, the only way we can vote, this is negative. We think that the only way we can vote is on election day, which is important. But we vote with our dollars. We vote with how we spend or don't spend money. So I would like to encourage all of you that if you have something that you're thinking about getting, instead of buying it at the big corporate store down the block or online, think about spending a little money and spread the wealth and do what you can. All right, we're going to take about a 10 or 15 minute break. The slips of paper will be here if you've never had your chart done. By virtue of submitting your name, you're basically saying that if I draw your name or someone draws your name out of the hat, you will actually engage. For those of you who have had enough of me tonight, I respect that. Thank you for being here, and this is your place and time where you can slip out the door. For the hardier, we will look at 3 charts just to kind of give you a sense of how this astrology works in real time with real people. And am I missing something? Yeah, fill these out. Fold it in half once. Fold it in half once, and put it in the hat. The hat. And we will come back and look at charts. So that's it. Thank you all for being here. One other thing. I know that many of you got here because you know of my YouTube or whatever, but remember that if you go to Rick Levine Astrologer, www.ricklevineastrologer.com, that'll get you on my email list, which is separate from YouTube. And that way, when I'm doing something or an event around town, you'll get to know that. And so do that. Business cards here on the table. I'm done. I'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you all.
And Rick, now we know why the price of
Jump back in. And greetings again to all of you folks, both here and online. I see, Healthy Quadrant says, we are frequency, energy, and vibration. Actually, that's almost what Nikola Tesla wrote. You see, I'm a quoteaholic and I actually know these things. What Tesla actually wrote was, if you want to know the secrets of the universe, you need to study energy, frequency, and vibration. Not quite the same, and yes, we might say that we are energy, frequency, and vibration. I think another way to say this is that there are no things in the universe. There are no things, because things that appear to be solid are actually what the Hindus would call Maya. It's the veil that covers up what they would say is a true reality. The illusion is things are solid, but the fact of the matter is that even atoms that seem to, were thought to be the solid particles that create, everything, that even atoms are made up of smaller things that appear to be solid until you look at them close enough to see that they are vibrations too, that everything that appears to be solid is actually created by nodes. And as astrologers, we know what the nodes of the moon are. It's where the orbit of the moon crosses the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And wherever 2 orbits intersect, they create a node, and node is simply Latin for a knot, K-N-O-T. And so reality is made up of high frequency electromagnetic radiation cycling at the tune of hundreds of trillions of cycles every second. And when these orbits intersect with each other and create nodes, they tie light up into knots. And so the illusion of three-dimensional physical reality is basically an illusion of energy crisscrossing with energy and creating the appearance of physicality, which is why the nodes of the moon are so important, because it's really the beginning of the interplay of who we are. It's the interplay of the subjective, objective, subjective moon, objective sun. And oh, I could start on that one for an hour or two, but we have work to do. It's the diehards that are here. All right, so we have 3 charts to do, and I am going to enter them one at a time. Remember, if your chart is chosen, we need you to identify yourself. You won't be on camera. However, I will ask that you be honest. I will not ask you to reveal anything in front of a lot of people that you don't want to. Then you can always say, no, I don't want to talk about that. But I do want you to be honest, because although it may feel like you're special, that you're getting your chart done, we don't give a crap about you. You're here being used, and you're here for our learning process. I'm really being a bit facetious, and I do hope that if your chart is picked, you do get something out of it. But it's a flavor and a taste of what might happen in a consultation, understanding that what we do or what I do in 5 or 10 minutes is not the same as what would happen in a depth consultation with a competent astrologer that would really go much, much deeper. So that being said, welcome back. And, whoop, we got a limp microphone there. There we go. All right, first chart that we got 3 charts picked, and Rana, and so I'm going to enter each of these and look at these charts with you for the first time. And before I do this, I'm going to have to exit the program and re-enter it because it doesn't want me to. So this is going to mess everything up for a moment. Just bear with me here a second I don't need to bore you with the details of the hoops that I am now jumping through, but there we go. Okay. So I am going to enter each of these 3 charts in and look at the chart with you for the first time. Is it RONNA?
Correct, yes.
And I put an SF after it, standing for soul food. That way I'll know later where this chart came from. March 24th, 1966. Yes. March 24th, 66. Time of day is 7:32 p.m., 7:32 p.m., and that is in Dawson Creek, British Columbia. Whoop, that was almost right. D-A-W-S-O-N, Dawson Creek. And that's going to be a C-A-N, I think will work fine there. And that does a latitude and longitude lookup and converts it to Pacific Standard Time. And from that, we now have a chart. But I don't think it's on, I got to get this on the live stream, so this will just take me a moment to do that. Oh.
It's on.
Is it on? Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Magic.
Oh, no, this is a different chart.
All right. So let's, all right, hang on a second. We will get there. And now we will go share screen and this and.
You have to select which window.
What's that?
You have to select which window to do.
Say it again.
You have to select the window.
Oh, yes. Ta-da! Oh. I'm not sure why that says that. Okay, are we good? Is it showing? Mm-hmm. All right. So, I'm going to turn so I can see you. Actually, I'm going to take this and so I can see you. All right. And Rana, what's your relationship with astrology?
Something I've been interested in my whole life. In the last probably 10 to 15 years, I've studied it a little more deeply, but...
So, and you have mid-Libra rising? This looks like your chart? Okay. So what's your favorite thing about your chart?
You know what? I find it interesting that I'm an Aries sun, I'm Mars in Aries, but I'm a Libra rising, so I'm kind of like the opposite of myself. It's weird.
So an Aries sun with, in fact, Mars at home in Aries with Libra rising.
Yeah.
And so one might imagine that the Aries part of you has an inner sense of knowing, you know, who you are, what you're doing, where you're going, and yet the outer world doesn't necessarily always see that part of you. They see the part of you that is more, I don't want to say acquiescent, is that a word? But cooperative, more willing to negotiate and navigate based upon how other people see you, which does not change what you're feeling or thinking on the inside, especially because when you were born the moon in Taurus, you know, I talked earlier about how in traditional astrology, every planet has a home sign. Mars, for example, is at home in Aries. So your Mars is strong. I have a Mars in Aries too. You know, if I'm in a car with someone, I'm going to be driving the car.
Me too. On the passenger side, I'm driving all the time.
And but I much prefer to actually. I love to drive a car. You know, and it's not like I need fast cars or racing cars. I don't mind going fast. Yes, I have a few speeding tickets. But that Mars in Aries wants to be in control of where it's going. Mars is at home in Aries. But every planet has a sign that it's not at home in, that it likes being in. And so, for example, although Mars is at home in Aries, or in traditional astrology in Scorpio also, Mars likes to be in Capricorn. It's like a king or queen in her castle. She gives the orders, that's cool, but sometimes it's better to be a queen in someone else's castle where you're an honored guest and treated like a queen. And so the reason why I'm talking about this concept of exaltation is that Mars is at home, so it's in its own space in Aries, but the sun is at home in Leo, where it shines, summer sun, bright. But when the sun is not in Leo, it likes to be in Aries. The sun is exalted in Aries. Now, the moon likes to be in Cancer, but when it's not in Cancer, it likes to be in Taurus. So your sun and your moon are both exalted, and Mars is in its domicile or home, which gives basically some pretty strong DNA. Without even looking at anything else in the chart, it basically suggests that your luminaries, your sun and your moon, are both vibrant because they're in places where they're exalted. And not only that, your sun is exalted in the sign of Mars, and Mars is at home there. So, you know, watch out. Watch out when you're angry, or you don't need to, maybe you do, but whoever they are, they do. Interesting paper written many years ago by Judith Hill, who's an astrologer who lives down in Portland, called Mars and the Redhead. Whether it's yours by birth or by acquisition doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that there is a high level of affinity between the planet Mars when it's humming and the redness of someone's hair, or for that matter, even complexion. So we have Mars and the sun in Aries. And then we have Mercury and Saturn and Chiron hanging back before the sun in Aries in Pisces, which I think in some ways, even that Mercury, I imagine that Mercury was in Aries before you were born and then retrograded back into Pisces. And so it's almost like there's a part of you that felt like you needed a little bit of the wateriness to restrain you, the emotional connection to keep you honest, so to speak. And what's interesting to me is even with the moon in Taurus, we look to Venus because Venus is at home in Taurus, and we look to Taurus, and we see the moon in Taurus, so we look to your Venus, and by the way, the Venus's other home is Libra, and so Venus is important in your chart because Venus is doing the work of your moon. Your moon says, Venus, do this for me, so to speak, and your ascendant also goes to Venus, but Venus is kind of like the proverbial fish, or in this case, scales of a fish, or scales out of water, because Venus in Aquarius is a bit intellectually oriented and a little bit it's emotionally cool. My old astrology buddy and partner in crime, who used to share this stage with me for many years, Jeff Jower, used to say that Aquarius loves humanity. It's the humans they hate. And there's something about Aquarius is like love without fluids. And I mean that in every sense one can imagine. And it's not that you're an Aquarius, but you have that strong Venus in Aquarius, which suggests that there's a part of you that is more attracted to the idea, the concept, the friendship, the intellectual engagement of what you value, rather than all of the emotional crap that comes along with it, even though that emotional crap is often the stuff that makes the real essence of what a dynamic relationship really means. I think I have the moon unaspected here because aspected points. And yep, hold on a second. Let's get the moon back into that picture. And now we see something else that's of interest to me immediately. And all the colored lines in the middle, of course, are aspects based upon divisions of a circle by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. I don't have 5 showing here, or 8. But for those of you who know my work, you know that I spend a lot of time looking at divisions by 5 and 7 and 9 and 11, because there's a whole bunch of magic there that we're not looking at tonight, called harmonic aspects. But what I do notice is, first of all, the thicker lines are the ones that are closest to being exact. And we see that the Saturn conjunct Chiron, but the Saturn at 21 degrees of water sign Pisces. It's hard for me to point here because my pointer goes to a different place. There it is. Saturn right there at 21, 22 degrees of Pisces is connected by that big, thick blue line, meaning a trine, to Neptune at 21 degrees of Scorpio, water to water. Trines show an energy that flows naturally. And so what this suggests is that the Saturn Chiron together in Pisces, now Saturn is in Pisces, which tells me that you're coming toward your second Saturn return about a year and a half down the road. And so there may already be a sense of looking back at your life and saying, what did I do around age 28, 29, 30, 31? What was the transitions that I made in my life then? Anything come to mind that you share?
Children.
Okay, so what were those transitions? Had they impact my whole life? And what's the transitions that I'm making now that in some way move me into a place where I'm going to solidify where I want to be for what I call the third of life, the next Saturn cycle?
I think, notwithstanding having the children, I was moving into a big part of my career, and I feel now, this many years later, I'm moving into a different part of my career, although I can't actually visualize what it is. I feel it.
Yeah. So, and you can't visualize what it is because it's still premature.
Yeah.
Because it's still about a year and a half down the road until that tunnel begins to enclose, and then you figure out what direction you're going to move in. But the thing about your Saturn in Pisces, Saturn is kind of odd in Pisces because Saturn is the planet of constriction, contraction, crystallization. It pulls in and makes things real. It's karma. It's you get what you deserve. Pisces is the fuzzy spot in the universe. And so when Saturn's in Pisces, which is where it is now for all of us, it's hard to know exactly what the fuck is going on. And there's a part of you that probably feels like that always on some level, even though the Aries always knows where it's at and what it's doing and where it's going, that when you really dig into it, it's like things dissolve a bit, especially because that Saturn is harmonizing or trining with Neptune, which is at home in Pisces, and Neptune's job is to dissolve the hard edges of Saturn. So you go through life basically dancing in this area that is creating boundaries that aren't really there or dissolving boundaries that really are. And with the fact that Chiron is in the mix, Chiron most people call the wounded healer, as if the wounded healer is Chiron's last name. Chiron, the wounded healer. But it's actually, Chiron was a centaur, and Chiron was granted immortality by the gods because he was such a brilliant teacher and healer, but teacher. And so from that standpoint, we forget that most teaching and most healing occurs by someone who's projecting their wounds and salving their own wounds by fixing the problem in others, so to speak. And so with your Chiron lined up with Saturn, and I know we had a short conversation, but I don't know that I asked you what you did or if that came up. But I would imagine here that whether it's as parent or as professional, there's something about that magic that you bring that has to do with, you know all the answers, but you somehow then dissolve or kind of teach people that it's, you kind of have to make it up. Okay, I do not take calls while I'm teaching. I forgot to turn my phone off. But there's something here about that work being integral to what it is that you do. What is it that you do or did? Or
Well, I used to train people to do a certain job that was a little bit difficult, and now I've moved into other aspects of that industry. But my boss liked to say that I had a client chair at my desk. So people will come and tell me their problems, what's going on. I've been that person who...
So there is that sense of you being the Saturn authority that's not really authority, that helps or heals people to find their own way.
I taught people to be 911 operators and police dispatchers.
All right, got it, cool. All right, but here's the other thing about that Saturn Chiron, and that is this fat red line, which, unlike the harmonious trine to spiritual Neptune, is 90 degrees or square to the Jupiter in Gemini. And that Jupiter in Gemini, you're coming into a Jupiter return next year. You probably felt that a little bit with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction already in April, but we'll probably feel it quite a bit more as Jupiter gets closer and closer to actually returning to where it was when you were born, as it does every 12 years. And in fact, Jupiter returns to where it was every 12 years. Saturn does it about every 30 years, which means that Saturn on its second time round, 60, is Jupiter's fifth time round. 12 times 5 is 60. And so around age 60-ish, we get our Jupiter and Saturn return at the same time. Pull it in and make something real happen from it. But you were born with Jupiter and Saturn and Chiron in the mix, and even Mercury. But you were born with Jupiter and Saturn in particular square, and with Chiron there too. And if you think of Saturn as the authority and the constriction, the crystallization, the make it real pulling energy in, and Jupiter as the potential of expanding it. There's something that's inherent to how you live of, it's a breathing process, but it's always like, I need to expand. Oh, I breathed in too much. I need to pull it back in. Oh, I should actually do this now. All right, no, I learned, I did it last time, it didn't work, I'm not gonna do it. Oh shit, I should have done it. All right, next time, and there's that kind of expand, contract, breathe in, breathe out, do it, don't do it, kind of on a deep level that becomes part of how you move through crisis. And on a bad day, it sucks because you don't know whether you should or you shouldn't. But on a good day, you see that as part of a process that I call, there's a Greek word, a Greek or Latin, that is a medical term called peristalsis. Anyone? Peristalsis is the action of expansion, contraction, alternating that moves things through your colon, through your esophagus. It's when you see a boa constrictor, not that you see them, but if you see a boa constrictor, eat a rabbit, and you see the bulge, and you see that bulge moving through, it's the expansion, contraction that pushes when you swallow. That's a contraction, but it sends a ripple of contraction, expansion that pushes things forward. That's Jupiter-Saturn. And that process for you is one that's louder and stronger, most likely, than it is for other people, because it's 90 degrees, it's a conflict. Though you don't get one without the other, and whichever one you get, the other one is there saying, no, this one would be better. However, you flow that energy out naturally through the spiritual, dreamy, imaginative possibilities of the trines to Neptune. Do you see how, does that make sense to you?
Makes complete sense.
Is this something you've thought about in your chart before?
It's something I've thought about, just the contrast.
The
contrast and the flow. When the flow happens, the flow is amazing. When the flow doesn't happen.
All right, so here's the thing that you haven't thought about that is the importance of why these non-zodiac aspects, the semi-square, the division by 8, is so important. Because if you take your Saturn square to Jupiter, Jupiter square to Saturn, and you find the point that's exactly halfway between them, that's your moon at 7 degrees of Taurus. And you can see here these fat orange lines. I'm moving my cursor on one screen and it's not there. There it is. All right. So you can see that the moon is a semi-square, 45 degrees to the Chiron Saturn on one side, and it's 45 degrees to Jupiter on the other side. In other words, it's halfway between that Jupiter and the Saturn Chiron. The half square is not weaker than the square. It's just more focused. It's a motivator. And in some ways, this is, I was going to say a pain in the butt, but it's actually a pain in the heart. It's a pain in the mind because your moon in Taurus, as solid and as stable and as comfortable as it is in Taurus, can't hold that comfortable, simple state when it's dealing with other people's expansion contraction problems that you have to solve. And that's the bugaboo of that moon in Taurus in the 7th house, because people come to you with that solid, their problems, their situations are not solvable by you just saying, oh, just go this way instead of that way, which in your life, the Aries part of you has no problem with when you're driving your own car. But when someone comes in with that moon in Taurus, it's like, it's like the proverbial, spanner in the works, the monkey, wrench in the gears, that basically is like, so that's something I bet you've never thought about. I mean, just, what do I want to say? Geometrically, because that moon at the halfway point, when anything aspects your moon, which is a strong moon, it's basically motivating you to resolve other stuff that's going on, because that conflict between the anxiety between the feeling that you know what's real and what's right, somehow doesn't match up with what you know you need to do in the outer world. And thankfully, you have that Libra rising, which allows you to look like you're dancing with grace. This isn't showing the aspect here, but the Venus, there it is, the Venus at 18 degrees of Aquarius is actually very closely trine to your ascendant at not quite 18 degrees, but at 16 and a half degrees of Libra. And so that your Venus, your connection, your niceness, your pleasantness, it's not really compassion, although there is compassion from the planets in Pisces, but that Venus comes out with the ability to be cool and detached and yet friendly and supportive. So,
That's spot on.
yeah, and you know, other than that, I would just make a mental note that back around, you know, quarantine time, back when Saturn and Pluto were moving through the 20 degrees of Capricorn, that was at the very bottom of your chart, and in some ways kind of finishing up a 7-year period of your life that, you know, that basically was like the changing of tide, and you now heading somewhere that is in a slightly different or new direction that is basically part of your whole, you know, this phase, this decade or decade and a half of your life.
Like that for 4 years, there's something new.
Yeah, and that's about when Saturn went over the bottom point, you know, that bottom point in your chart. And then the other thing I would note also is that over the past couple of years, maybe back about I'm not going to look at the detailed dates here, but about 2-3 years ago, as Uranus was moving through Taurus, it lined up with your moon, and so there may have been a period of a year in there of a little bit of craziness, emotional instability, kind of like, you know, exciting and now what kind of a thing.
I completely agree.
Care to share any of that?
You know what, I've been asked to start different ventures. I get started, it looks like it's happening, then it's not happening.
Okay.
And I get asked for something else, looks like it's happening, it's not happening.
Yeah.
So, again, looking for something new coming, but it's coming, it's not coming, it's coming, it's not coming.
Yeah. Well, just keep in mind that as Jupiter returns through this year, whether this fully manifests or not is not the issue, but it's time to grab a golden ring, to reach for something, because it'll be the motion of reaching for it. And the danger of Jupiter transits is like being on the old merry-go-rounds where they really did have the ring, and that if you got and you reached for it if you were on the outer perimeter, you know, of the merry-go-round, and if your horse happened to have been going up when you hit the ring and you reached it, chances are it was just a bronze or iron ring, but if it was a gold ring, then you got a free ride.
Yeah.
And the problem, though, is with Jupiter is that it's easy to reach too far and fall off the horse. That's the danger of too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So just keep that in mind. All right, and thank you. All right. Well, I don't know. Did anybody? I'm looking. Yeah. And let's see. Lynn says, "I always learn so much as you explore other people's charts." Rick, hi, Lynn. Nice to see you here. And yeah. I'm not keeping my eye on that. I think Gail is handling those comments that are coming up. The Unspeakable says, that's the best Jupiter square Saturn explanation I've ever heard. Well, good. It's mine. You know, Jupiter square Saturn is, the thing that people forget, and because you have that Saturn trine Neptune and the Jupiter quincunx Neptune. Quincunx is 5/12. It's an odd aspect. It's Ptolemy called the quincunx, well, he called it an inconjunct, meaning that there was no connection. And in fact, there are still astrologers who would look at that and say 150 degrees, that's an inconjunct. That is the Hellenistic Ptolemaic version of it. But what people forget, moderners forget, is that in traditional astrology, 2 planets were considered to be conjunct by trine or conjunct by square. The word conjunct meant that there was a connection between them. And so when a planet was not connected, they were called inconjunct. And so Ptolemy said that 2 planets that were 30 degrees apart, let's say a planet at 10 degrees of Aries and a planet at 10 degrees of Pisces, that would be an inconjunct because those planets had no way of seeing each other. They were not conjunct. But if you had two planets, one away from an opposition, like your Jupiter is to Neptune, the opposition to Neptune would be at 21 degrees of Taurus, 22 degrees actually, because it's 2156. So Jupiter is one sign away, and Ptolemy called that an inconjunct. We moderners refer to that as a quincunx. Quinc Latin for 5, unx Latin for 12. It's 5/12. And a quincunx is an irritation. It's an annoying piece. Why? Because of your Saturn Chiron. This is a perfect example. When you have two planets that are quincunx one to another, and I'm still talking about the Jupiter-Saturn square, but I'm on a little bit of a jaunt here that is too good of a teaching moment to let go. I'm convinced that the best way to teach astrology is by looking at a real chart and seeing something that you use to teach rather, I mean, it's assuming that a real student is going to read the books and learn about what the different aspects are. But the best way to understand why a quincunx is so annoying, so irritating, so impossible, it's because every quincunx has a point or 2 points that are square one side of it and trine the other. What that means is that if you have two planets that are quincunx, there's always a point that is, wow, this is awesome, this sucks. At the exact same time.
Completely identified.
That's a quincunx. It's irritating and annoying, unlike a square. A square is major conflict, but you get to resolve it. Even if you don't fix it, you get to work with it and make something real. With a trine, the energy just flows. With a quincunx, you're getting the square and the trine, or a sextile and a square at the same time, depending on which side it's on. So I also have a Jupiter quincunx very tight, but not to Neptune. Mine's Jupiter quincunx Saturn. But there's the quincunx. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention that is that we're back talking about the Jupiter-Saturn square and that being the best explanation that whoever it was, I'm sorry, I don't remember what said that it was the best explanation ever. But Jupiter is expansive, but Jupiter has an issue, and that is it's contained by Saturn. Think of a balloon, and you blow up a balloon. You get to a certain spot where it's just not going to go any further. That's Saturn. Jupiter, when it reaches Saturn, that's the limit. It can't go further, or it pops. That's a Jupiter thing. It explodes. Jupiter, pop, explode, bang, boom. These are all Jupiter words because it's what happens when Jupiter meets its limit. Neptune is simply Jupiter in drag. Neptune is Jupiter who's escaped from dad. Saturn being dad. Jupiter says, I want to get big, I want this balloon to blow up. And Saturn says, can't go any further than here because this is reality in the three-dimensional world. I am the boss, and this is the speed limit. You can't go any faster. Neptune says, ain't no speed limits in my imagination. I can go at the speed of light. Neptune is Jupiter escaped from Saturn. It's why Neptune is dreamy and imaginative. And remember, to the ancients who didn't know that there was a Neptune, Jupiter ruled or was at home in both Sagittarius, expansive, the arrow aiming into the sky, and at home in Pisces. And when Neptune was discovered, it was given to Pisces because it seemed to be even more Jupiterian than Jupiter because it didn't ever have to stop. Now back to the Jupiter-Saturn square in your chart that's so important because your Jupiter and Neptune, it's like, where do I stop? When do I stop? And Saturn basically saying to Neptune, hey, spirit has no limits, go anywhere. And Jupiter saying, nope, can't go past dad's rules. Anyhow, we cycled back into that one. Thanks for being here. All right. Jennifer, are you here? Where? Jennifer, you need to come a little bit closer if you don't mind. I'm not a demanding kind of person normally, but come on into the group. That way I can just see you. All right, and I'm going to put up Jennifer's chart, and all right. All right, Jennifer, born September 30th, 73? At 2:48 in the morning. In Seattle. And Jennifer, what's your story with astrology? Study, know, play, think?
Oh, I don't know. It got me in 2019 and it just won't let go.
Okay, so kind of a interested and serious somewhat student. All right. And 18 degrees Leo rising, does that look like you? Close enough? All right. What's the thing that you hate the most about your chart?
You know, everything when I first got to know it, but I'm kind of in love with it now. It has kicked my ass. Like, it has absolutely kicked my ass, but I feel like it's made me very strong at this point. Like, I can.
So the first thing that I notice about your chart, and I don't know how this happens, but it does. Often when we do 2 or 3 charts like this, they all have some, or at least there's a theme that seems to repeat. In Jennifer's chart, she has Jupiter quincunx Saturn, which I have in my chart that I mentioned before when we were looking at Rana's chart, because she has Jupiter quincunx Neptune. You have Jupiter quincunx Saturn, but you have the Pluto, actually Pluto-Sun conjunction, but Pluto at that point, that's square one side and trine the other. It's the same issue, but with different planets in a different context. So let's explore what that is. First of all, the Jupiter-Saturn quincunx is different than the Jupiter-Neptune quincunx. I'll tell you how my Jupiter-Saturn quincunx works, and Gail, who's online managing the chat, will probably pipe in because she knows my Jupiter-Saturn quincunx, because I will do whatever it is I'm supposed to do, usually at the last second. Not because I intend to, but because someone says, hey, let's go out and take a walk at the park. Oh, okay, I have this to do, but I'll do it later. In other words, Jupiter is the possibility of doing something that says, you know, let's grow, let's learn, let's expand. And Saturn is the commitment, is the being responsible. And there's this irritation between the two of them. I've said to people putting on conferences, when a deadline occurs, I call them up and say, you know, I know the deadline's tomorrow. Yes, Rick, the deadline's tomorrow. Well, am I the only person that hasn't submitted? She goes, no, you and blah, 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 and blah, blah. I go, okay, I won't be the last person. You know, and I'm not saying that this is an admirable trait of mine. All I'm saying is that Eric says we have video-proof Jupiter, Mars, and Venus are wandering stars, not ball planets. I'm not quite sure what. Well, certainly Jupiter is a failed, I mean, certainly Jupiter could be considered to be part of a binary star system. I mean, it's a star that didn't quite reach ignition mass. And that's another story. It's not for here for now. But I think that the more significant thing in your chart is that once a year, the sun lines up with each of the outer planets for a couple of days. And you were born with the sun in Libra lining up with Pluto, which makes you an un-Libra Libra. Because, you know, and it doesn't mean that you're not nice, because Libras are nice. Libras are, you know, they get along with people. They're the intermediaries. They're very very strategic. And most people don't realize that Libra is like the strategist of the zodiac, because in that ability of weighing and balancing, this is, the art of war. It's playing chess or Go. It's like figuring out that strategy. But Pluto, as the shadow realms, as the death rebirth, as the lord of the underworld, one would imagine that as bright as your Leo rising might be, and people see, people who say Jennifer, they go, Jennifer, until they know you. And then they go, Jennifer. Because the Leo rising is the sunshine that does, it's the dance you dance when you meet someone new. And yet by the second or third dance, they realize that they're dancing with Darth Vader. And that there's a bit of a dark side here. But what's intriguing about your dark side is that it's harmonized or trine with bright Jupiter. And it's important to understand that right now, as Pluto has just touched into Aquarius, you're at the very, very, very front edge of a year and a half or so of Pluto moving across Jupiter, where it isn't quite reaching right now, backing away, and then in December, when Pluto moves back into Aquarius and through next year, that Pluto is going to be going over your Jupiter, and Jupiter brings up the bright stuff. It brings up the opportunity, and you have Jupiter trine your natal Pluto, and so in a way, you always have that. Somehow you get to be Dr. Death with the candy. Does that make sense a little bit? Tell us what.
Absolutely, yes.
Tell us something that connects with that to you, for you.
Yeah, well, Pluto has brought me to some very, very, very dark places that I never really wanted to go. I've done most of my personal planet transits with Pluto, so I'm glad to be a Jupiter at this point. But it's also the sun, so it takes me through a lot of dark shit. With, protection, I guess, and maybe Jupiter plays into that.
Yeah. Well, and I think you have more protection even from the fact that Jupiter, which is trine to Pluto and the sun, kind of bringing opportunity and learning and growth from that you look at Neptune, and Neptune is halfway in between them, but instead of like in Rana's chart where it was semi-square both ways, in your chart it's sextile, so that Neptune becomes an important feeder into this. And in fact, if you look at Neptune to Jupiter, and you made the halfway point between both of those, opposite that would be Saturn, and that sextile between Jupiter and Neptune, and their mutual quincunxes to Saturn, make this what's called a finger of God or a yod. And there's a whole, on Astrology Hub, I have a whole seminar on this, what's called a yod, which is really like an isosceles triangle. It's a sextile, and the quincunx sides are the same. And what it means is that the combined energy here of Jupiter and Saturn, kind of like in Rana's chart, Rana. It's like that energy of expand only this far, no, expand all the way. Those two things work together, and yet they still have to come out through the structure of Saturn on the other side, because that becomes like the point of the pyramid there also. There's two other things I noticed, and then we'll, three other things I want to say. One is that you were born, if Mars was the sun, you would have been born at high noon. You were born with Mars on the midheaven, at the highest point on the chart. And there are branches of astrology that say the midheaven is actually a stronger point than the ascendant. We think of the ascendant as, our personality, who we are. It's our interface with the outer world. It's how others see us, all of that. But the midheaven is really our place in the outer world where we stand up and do what we do. It's kind of like our personal mission statement. In your chart, Mars is in Taurus and it's retrograde, meaning it's closer to Earth than it is at other times in its cycle, which means that the Mars in your chart is loud, which means that sometimes that's problematic because the Mars can be not only loud, but in Taurus, it ain't moving unless it wants to. And if it wants to, it ain't stopping. Because Mars in Taurus is like Newton's third law of motion. It's an object at rest is going to rest. And an object in motion is going to stay in motion. And it doesn't like changing its speed or its trajectory unless it's internally motivated. And it can be very stubborn. And in some way on your midheaven, this is somehow tied to what you do in the outer world. I don't know what that is, or but in some way, I think it's you're bringing your ability, your Libran ability to be that go-between, but having that Plutonic sense of the dark, of the power, of the intensity, the volatility, and somehow having to work that out through the Mars, even though they don't get along. That's another quincunx. They're in fact irritating one another. What do you do,
Well,
if anything?
Right now, nothing. But I was a teacher for a lot of years, and I've done a lot of different jobs. But yeah, I really have gotten into, arts and writing and traveling and talking to people everywhere about peace. I'm struggling to find it within myself, and I feel like that's the actual key.
So I don't know if people online can hear you or not, but you spoke about the being a teacher and doing many things, but you said writing and writing and or teaching, whether it's in school or not. But other things that I noticed before we move on. One is that you were born with Mercury lined up with Uranus, which is, and again, all in Libra. This is a stellium. These are 4 planets in Libra. So there's a strong Libran influence, but it's not typical Libra because Uranus in Libra lined up with Mercury is an intellect that is like lightning. It's like you're a fast learner, even though the Mars in Taurus may be sometimes plodding and slow. There's a part of you intellectually, light goes on, you got it. And that creates a bit of restlessness. It creates a bit of fieriness or feistiness sometimes when you think something and you say it and it pisses other people off or upsets them or whatever. But that Mercury and Uranus combined is also indicative of the person who is the writer, who would write stuff very different, your own. Mila says that she imagines that you're a psychic, knowing what people are going to say at times and knowing what they're going to say before they say it. And is that true?
I think I also have the South Node and Saturn conjunct, sort of. And,
Yes.
And time works very differently for me. So there's nothing linear about the way I experience time. Lots of stuff happens, I will see it, and then it will meet me later.
Got it. And by the way, thank you, Allie. Nice to see you. Allie in Texas says that she can, you are being heard online. So thank you for that. So the thing about Mercury, Uranus, if there's a bit of psychicness, is that it can hit or miss. Because it's like the lights are on and then they're off. It's like when it strikes, it strikes. And I would caution, or I would suggest someone with a strong Mercury, Uranus to wait until the question is fully asked before they answer it. Because often when someone starts asking a question, you already know the answer. And sometimes you're interrupting them and answering it, but you're not answering the question that they were trying to ask. And I don't mean you in particular. I don't know if that's true of you, but it's the energy. Yeah. So but that's something about that Mercury Uranus. I consider that, brilliant when the lights are on, and just as dumb as the rest of us when the lights are not on.
Yeah, so the dumb as rocks and true.
Yeah. The other piece that I would not want to miss talking about briefly is the fact that Venus was aligned with the moon in Scorpio. And this is also not easy, but volatile and intense and passionate when passions are aroused. And the thing about passions this intense is that we learn early on that it's not good to express them always because, gee, people seem to walk away. Or, you know, it's that the best friend that goes, God, I had no idea it was so late, I gotta go, and they never come back kind of a thing. And I'm not saying that this is a theme, but Pluto at home in Scorpio, Mars on your midheaven stationary or retrograde at home in Scorpio, and Venus a bit over intense in Scorpio lined up with the moon. There's a part of you that when you feel stuff that other people don't even, you can explain to them, they still don't get it. I mean, it's like the words don't explain the depth, the width, the intensity, the power, the volatility, the passion that you feel things. And often the way in which you get by is you go to the Leo rising and just go, because that way at least you can get through a situation where you may be having a very different internal process. And one of the powerful things about that becomes for you is the Scorpio ability with that Scorpio moon and Venus is to be able to take stuff that is difficult, send it into what I call the cyclotron, into the nuclear reactor until the uranium or the plutonium turns into gold. And that's the deeper, I think, alchemical task of your chart is to constantly work with the shadow, the dark, the Pluto as part of an evolutionary process that sometimes has to be done, like some important things have to be done alone and in the dark, and turn that into something that becomes manifested as that Leo rising that's no longer a cover for the dark, but it's the dark transformed into something that is beautiful and loving and, you know, and needs to be shared. Does that make sense to you a little bit?
Yeah.
And I would say from a standpoint of transits, I mean, the significant thing going on, aside from the fact that the what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, that the the solar eclipse was at 21 degrees of Aries. Is that where it was? I think so. No, 19. Yeah, 19 degrees, which was exactly on your Chiron and opposite your Uranus. So I imagine there may have been some connection to either what's going on or has gone on there. And then the other thing, of course, is the Pluto coming toward that early degrees of Aquarius is still a year out for, you know, until it's really, really there, a year or two, because that is going to also trine your natal Pluto and trine your natal Sun over the next 2, 3, 4 years or so. And that's going to be very powerful. You're going to have energy that's in the bank that you didn't know you had stored from the work that you've done. I think it's going to be not necessarily easy, but much more flowing than perhaps some changes or transits have been in the past. Huh?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Things always sound good until they're like, until they're next to us, and they'll go, "What the hell is that about? What did I do?" All right. Oh, and by the way, I didn't say one other thing that goes back to something you said at the very beginning about it being hard, or you know that you've. And the first thing that I noticed when I looked at your chart was the square between Pluto and the Sun to Saturn. I mean, Pluto square Saturn, we talked about the Pluto-Saturn connections, you know, being events like, oh, the beginning of World War I and the World Trade Tower. I mean, you know, these are, Saturn is boundary. Pluto is deconstruction, reconstruction. It's when boundaries meet and something has to give and change and re-evolve. And you have that as part of your natal birthright. And on top of that, with the Sun squaring Saturn, it's likely, I would imagine, that you grew up in an environment where it didn't matter how awesome you weren't good enough, tall enough, short enough, smart enough, skinny enough, fat enough, fast enough, boy enough, whatever it was. There was stuff that you had to work harder, and you seem to have to work harder to get to some of the same places that other people get to. And even when you're there, you never really trust it because there's something about some message that says everything has to be hard. And I'm not saying that it isn't. Does that make sense to you a little bit?
You read me, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for sharing and for being here. And as they say, last but not least, we have Michael, born July 7. Hey, Michael. Yeah, you're okay. I can kind of see you enough. All right, let's get your chart in, do something here, and then we'll call it a day, or we'll actually call it a month. All right, we have Michael 7761, 7761, born at 12:30 a.m., 12:30 a.m. in Washington, D.C. What did I do? I don't know what I did. Back this up. Okay, stop. Oh, it's because I made it Washington. There we go. That should do it. Still not. Oh, because I just had G in the wrong place. That's what happened. Washington. Now we got it. All right. Whew. All right. Michael, what's your story with astrology?
Know nothing novice.
Know nothing novice. Well, let's correct that to you know a lot of stuff, but not about this novice.
Depends how you look at it.
No, that's how I look at it.
I did have a Vedic chart done many years ago.
Okay.
But I've never had a Western chart done, so I don't know anything if that's right or not.
Well, there are some things that will be the same. The angles between the planets are the same whether we look at it through a Vedic or Hindu, or correctly called Jyotish, which is the study of Vedic astrology, that maps the planets against the actual stars, versus Western astrology, which maps the planets against the seasons. And I don't want to talk more about what those differences are, but the planets are the same and the angles they make between themselves are the same. And for example, you would have Venus trine Saturn in either or both systems, because the angle between Venus and Saturn was about 120 degrees. And without even noting the fact that you are a Cancer sun, oh, and look, we have another Taurus moon, and your Taurus moon is very closely opposed Neptune. So part of the dilemma here is the dilemma of the stability and sensibility and common sense and feet on the ground of that Taurus moon, of being reliable. And even when things change, there's a part of you that knows where you are and knows how to integrate, or there's a reliability to it. However, that moon is exactly opposite Neptune, which means as soon as you bring something in from the outside, another person, an event, a relationship of any sort, well, that's when it gets confusing. That Neptune is the source of both spirituality and the breakdown of what we think of as real. And Neptune in your chart then therefore is important, because in some ways one of the issues of your chart is the dance between how subjectively certain you can be, but in the outer world how uncertain or how complicated things are, because your feelings may not match up with what's going on circumstantially. You add that to that the fact that when you were born, the sun was in Cancer, and Cancer is related to the moon. So your moon in Taurus is going to hum back to the sun. But you know, the sun in Cancer is tricky, because the sun is about outgoing energy. It's about illumination. It's about being bright. It's about shining. And Cancer is about the shell of the crab that holds feelings in. And so one might assume, notice how I didn't say Michael is blah, blah, blah. I would say one might assume, correctly or not correctly, that Michael appears with an Aries rising a lot more certain and a lot more directive and directional and more competent and capable in the three-dimensional world than the Cancer inside that's trying to shine, that is really much softer, more gentle, more vulnerable, and sometimes it's difficult for that part to find a place in the outer world. I don't know, do you relate to any of that?
That's pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. Let the record reflect that the witness said, yeah, yeah, very good. There is a caution to how much does one expose one's feelings, vulnerabilities, because the Aries rising is really suggesting that one should know what's going on. It's the old Knights of the Round Table thing, you know, you don't show weakness, you know, it's the military mind of being competent and always having, the macho presentation. But, with the moon in a yin or feminine earth sign and the sun in water, Mercury retrograde, in Cancer, water, there's a lot of softer energy in this chart, even though the Aries rising, I think, tends to present a more definitive external, and again, it's not that that's who you are, it's not that it's a cover, but it's really how the energy comes off of you for survival. Do you relate to that at all? Yeah? And then back to what I started with, that is the same in Vedic or in Western astrology, and that is the trine, the harmonious trine between Venus and Saturn. Now, they're both in earth signs. They're close to the same degree. It's a couple degrees away from being exact. That would be, let's say, 27 degrees of Capricorn and 27 degrees of Taurus. But it's close enough that it's a strong aspect. And Saturn in Capricorn, Saturn's at home in Capricorn. This again is the competent person who takes responsibility and does what they need to do. Now, Venus in Taurus, Venus is at home in Taurus. And Venus likes being in Taurus because Taurus is the sensual side. It's the physical side of what you like. There's that touchy-feely, it's, with that and the moon in Taurus, there's a bit of, and maybe Michael won't acknowledge this in front of anyone, and that's okay, but, there's a bit of a cuddle bunny here, regardless of how tough he might need to at certain times present that, himself to be competent, and I'm not even asking him to acknowledge that, it's okay. However, and this is a strong however, that Saturn being trined, remember trine's an easy flow of energy, to Venus, basically Saturn stiffens that, this is going to sound all wrong, that Saturn stabilizes that energy to the extent that the Venus in Taurus isn't as easy to access or express because of the rules of the sense of needing to be a certain, or to have, I know how to say it. It's Venus would like immediate gratification. In Taurus, Venus, wants the touchy-feely, the good food, the good wine, the nice sheets, the whatever it is that Venus in Taurus says, if the senses are sensing good things, then what could be wrong? Saturn in Capricorn says, I'll tell you what could be wrong. This isn't going to last more than an hour or a day or a week. Saturn will vote for and impose upon Venus long-term good feelings that endure for immediate gratification. And there's a part of this chart with the Aries rising that kind of the immediate gratification, I don't mean this only in relationships or sexually or anything like that, but that Mars, or the Aries rising is great at dealing with that immediate thing in the moment, but there's a whole part of your chart that always says, no, the immediate thing isn't as important as wherever the long-term venture is. And then we look at the Aries rising, and we say, well, what planet rules or is at home in Aries? And we look at your Mars, and your Mars is in Virgo, lined up with Pluto, and now we come back to this depth and the intensity and the power and the passion that's like a laser beam. And if someone thinks that you're cold, if someone thinks that you're detached, if someone thinks that you don't have feelings, it's just because your laser ain't directly on them. Because when your laser is on someone, because Virgo is like a laser beam, it's not cool and detached. If I have a flood lamp and I aim it over here towards Jennifer, then everyone over there can still see that that lamp is on. But if I have a laser beam and I aim it at Darlene, Callie sitting 2 inches away won't see anything because the laser beam is so exacting. And that you have that Mars and Pluto together, which is like a nuclear thermos. It's furnace, not thermos. It's like having nuclear meltdown always at the tip of your emotional feelings. With the Cancer sun and the Mercury retrograde in Cancer, you're not going to tell that to everyone. You're going to hold that energy in. But that laser beam, when it gets to shine, if it does directly on someone, there's no question at all that you're not cool and cold and detached. It's just that your love or your attention or your energy is not on that person. Does that ring to you at all? Yeah. And again, note the, this is important. I'm not putting you on the spot, nor am I making fun of you, but people are so much their charts. It's just that it's not the, oh my gosh, that's really like me, let me tell you how it is, because that Cancer sun combined with the intensity of whatever it is going to come off and it just, boom, yeah, sure. Anyhow, when it comes to transits, you know, I think right now in the sky, you got Jupiter coming towards your Venus, as Jupiter is moving towards the end of Taurus and toward its move into Gemini by the end of May. I would imagine that there's something coming to you that is really good. You may already be in it. You may be at the front end of something that you're feeling like might have some potential or longevity, whether it's a relationship or a project or work or something you're doing or something, because as Jupiter over this last year, Jupiter has come up over your moon and expanded that whole piece. And in fact, even going back a couple of years ago, like Rana, do you have the moon in Taurus? That as Uranus a few years ago was going over your moon, there may have been a period of exciting disruption, you know, where stuff was going on that was not what you were expecting, but things were happening, and it may have been destabilizing either on the emotional or home front. But I think that settled down quite a bit, but there's some opportunity, I think, that's flying around you that, you know, that is up for grabs. And I don't know if you can sense any of that or if you have anything in mind. But if you do, I would focus on it. And if you don't, I would pay attention to the potential of it. And that brings us to the end of part 2, I think. Any comments, thoughts, feedback?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Is there any significance that giant red X will know?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Is there any significance to that giant red X will know?
The question is there any significance to the giant X, the red X? And the answer is no. It's just basically two oppositions that are going to be, if you have multiple oppositions, they're going to always cross in this, the lines are always going to cross in the center. And yes, the fact that there are two oppositions, I think is important, and that there is even a thin blue line connecting those points on the opposition suggests again that on the outside, I think people see things smoother and easier than on the inside, where you feel like the tug of war, the stress, it's not really, it's tension, it's things pulling in opposite ways that are basically presented on the outside, packaged easier than they might be experienced from the inside out. So yeah, there is some significance, but good question. Everything has significance.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments, thoughts, feedback? I'll see you all here next month. And again, this will be online. Darlene.
I have a question. You know how Saturn in Capricorn is so rigid at first? But then as they get older, this is my observation, that as they get older, I've asked everyone this, Saturn in Capricorn's dad, it usually softens, or the mother for that matter, can soften as they get older and become more mushy.
And I'm going to out you. Darlene is a longtime, full-time practicing professional astrologer. And the observation, I think, is a good observation that really goes to, I think, is it the historical Merlin, if there was one, or was it Benjamin Button who lived life backwards? Capricorn energy tends to be born old and grow young. And it's like, as a kid, often people with Capricorn energy, and Saturn in Capricorn is certainly Capricorn energy, and a Capricorn midheaven certainly is Capricorn energy, that often people with a lot of Capricorn energy are either brought up by grandparents or have friends that are older, or in some way seem older and more responsible, and they don't play as well or as easily or lightheartedly as some of the other kids. But then as they grow up, the other kids are covering up for the things that they weren't responsible for when they were young. And now it's like the three little pigs, they're all living in straw houses or wood houses, when the Capricorn energy is living in a brick house, doesn't have to worry about that, and then they get to play. And I think often that Capricorn energy loosens up and plays more as it ages, whereas all the other signs go through the normal stages of being a kid and growing old and tightening and dying grouchy. That sounded awful.
Grinch meets Cindy.
But, huh?
The Grinch meets Cindy.
There you go. Yeah, so thank you. And thank you all for participating. I'll see some of you online, some of you on mid-month update for those of you on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rick Levine if you want other ways to find me online. And other than that, thank you all. And thank you for all of you online. Even after all of that, we've only lost a few people. We've been on 3 hours, and we still have nearly 500 people online. So thank you all for supporting this work. Appreciate you. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, think cosmically, act locally.